Fear of rejection shapes more lives than people are willing to admit. It silently governs choices, relationships, and even identity itself. Carl Jung believed that what we fear most often holds the key to our freedom. Rejection does not wound us because it harms us, but because it threatens the image we hold of ourselves. When this fear loosens its grip, something remarkable happens. The psyche regains its autonomy. You stop living through anticipation of judgment and begin acting from inner truth. Transformation begins not when you are accepted, but when acceptance is no longer required. When we speak of the fear of rejection, we are not speaking merely of social discomfort. We are speaking of a deeper psychological threat, the fear that the image we present to the world will be exposed as fragile or insufficient. I called this image the persona, the mask we develop to function in society, to be accepted, understood, and valued. From early life, we learn which parts of ourselves are welcomed and which are not. Slowly, we construct a version of ourselves that fits expectation. Rejection feels dangerous because it threatens this construction. The persona is necessary. Social life would be impossible. But trouble begins when a person identifies completely with this mask. When the persona becomes mistaken for the self, rejection no longer feels like feedback. It feels like annihilation. A rejected idea, behavior, or expression is experienced as a rejection of one's entire being. This is why fear takes hold so strongly. The psyche believes its survival depends on continued approval. Much of what people call anxiety is, at its core, anxiety about the persona failing. One hesitates to speak, to act, to choose freely, because the mask must be protected. Life becomes a performance rather than an expression. The individual adapts constantly, adjusting tone, desire, and conviction to avoid exclusion. Over time, this adaptation creates inner division. The outer life may appear stable, but the inner life grows increasingly silent and constrained. Rejection, however, has a hidden function. It reveals where we have over-identified with the persona. When rejection wounds deeply, it is often because something false is being defended. The psyche reacts not because the self is in danger, but because an image is. This realization is uncomfortable, yet liberating. It allows one to ask a new question. Who am I when I am no longer trying to be accepted? As this question is faced honestly, fear begins to loosen. One starts to sense that rejection does not destroy the self. It exposes the limits of the mask. The ego becomes less dependent on applause and less frightened by disapproval. Authenticity begins to replace performance. This shift does not make one reckless or indifferent, but grounded. One can participate in society without being consumed by it. And perhaps this is the first quiet turning point of freedom, when rejection no longer threatens who you are, but simply clarifies who you are not. When approval becomes the primary source of self-worth, the ego slowly loses its center. Instead of drawing strength from inner conviction, it begins to rely on external response to confirm its value. This shift may appear harmless at first. After all, human beings are social by nature, but psychologically, it carries a quiet cost. The ego that depends on validation becomes reactive. It no longer acts from understanding, but from anticipation of how it will be received. In such a state, decisions are rarely free. One chooses words carefully, not to express truth, but to avoid disapproval. One shapes ambition to fit what will be admired rather than what feels necessary. Over time, this constant adjustment fragments the personality. Parts of the self that do not earn approval are suppressed, while others are exaggerated. The individual becomes divided, performing confidence outwardly while experiencing doubt inwardly. The ego appears active, but it is not sovereign. I have observed that the need for approval weakens the ego, not because approval is inherently harmful, but because it replaces inner authority. The person no longer asks, "Is this true for me?" but "Will this be accepted?" This reversal is subtle yet decisive. Life becomes guided by reaction rather than intention. The ego loses its capacity to stand alone. It becomes anxious, defensive, and increasingly cautious, mistaking safety for stability. Rejection, in this context, feels unbearable because it exposes this dependency. When approval is withdrawn, the ego feels hollow. But this emptiness is not a failure. It is an invitation. It reveals where the ego has surrendered its responsibility to define itself. When one endures this discomfort without rushing to restore validation, something important happens. The ego begins to reorganize itself around inner values rather than external response. This process is rarely dramatic. It unfolds quietly through small acts of honesty and restraint. One resists the impulse to explain oneself. One tolerates misunderstanding. One allows silence where justification once lived. These moments strengthen the ego in a way praise never could. Gradually, confidence becomes less dependent on agreement. Identity becomes less fragile. The ego that no longer seeks constant approval becomes more stable, not less social. It can engage others without dissolving into them. It can accept rejection without collapsing. This is not indifference, it is self-possession. And perhaps this is the deeper transformation rejection offers, when approval no longer defines you. Your ego finally learns to stand on its own ground. When rejection occurs, it rarely affects only the surface of the personality. It reaches downward, touching parts of the psyche that are already uncertain, already sensitive. What rises in response, shame, anger, envy, self-doubt, often feels disproportionate to the event itself. This is because rejection does not merely exclude us from others. It activates what has long been excluded within us. In this way, rejection becomes a doorway to the shadow. The shadow contains aspects of the self that were once judged unacceptable weaknesses, desires, fears, and impulses that did not fit the image we were encouraged to present. These parts were not removed because they were harmful, but because they were inconvenient. Rejection stirs them because it echoes an old message: this part of you does not belong. The psyche responds not only to the present situation, but to its own unfinished history. Most people attempt to escape this discomfort quickly. They blame others, harden themselves, or retreat into self-criticism. But these reactions miss the deeper opportunity. The emotions triggered by rejection are not enemies, they are signals. They point toward parts of the personality that seek recognition and integration. Anger may reveal boundaries that were never claimed. Shame may uncover values borrowed from others rather than chosen. Envy may point toward unlived potential. I have often seen that those most wounded by rejection are not weak, but incomplete. They have learned to survive by narrowing themselves, by hiding what was once rejected. When rejection returns later in life, it feels intolerable because it threatens to expose what has been kept in the dark. Yet this exposure is precisely what allows growth. What is brought into consciousness loses its power to govern behavior unconsciously. Shadow integration does not mean indulging every impulse or justifying harmful behavior. It means understanding the meaning of these reactions and reclaiming the energy bound within them. When the shadow is acknowledged, emotional responses become less extreme. The individual no longer needs to defend an idealized image of themselves. Compassion deepens, not only toward others, but inwardly. Rejection then becomes transformative when it is used as a mirror rather than a verdict. It shows where the self is still divided, where fear has replaced understanding. When these parts are integrated, rejection loses its sting. It becomes information rather than injury. And perhaps this is the quiet gift hidden within rejection. It does not show you what is wrong with you. It shows you what is still waiting to be made whole. There comes a moment in psychological development when the desire for approval begins to loosen, not because one has become indifferent to others, but because something more central has awakened. I called this movement individuation, the process by which a person becomes a psychological whole rather than a social adaptation. Fear of rejection weakens precisely at this point because the source of identity shifts inward. One no longer lives primarily from the question, "How am I seen?" but from the quieter, more demanding question, "Am I being true?" Individuation does not begin with confidence. It often begins with isolation. As a person steps away from automatic conformity, they may feel misunderstood or even rejected. Well, this is not a punishment. It is a natural consequence of no longer organizing one's life around collective expectation. The psyche must separate itself before it can integrate itself. This separation is often uncomfortable because it removes familiar reference points. Yet without it, the self remains entangled in approval and fear. I have seen that many people remain psychologically immature, not because they lack intelligence or morality, but because they fear standing alone inwardly. Approval provides reassurance. Rejection threatens collapse. Individuation demands a different kind of strength, the capacity to endure inner solitude without abandoning oneself. This endurance allows deeper values to surface. Choices begin to reflect inner necessity rather than outer pressure. Life gains coherence even when it becomes more complex. As this process unfolds, rejection changes meaning. It is no longer interpreted as proof of inadequacy, but as evidence of differentiation. Not everyone must understand you. Not everyone will agree. This realization does not harden the heart, it steadies it. One becomes capable of genuine relationship because connection is no longer built on self-erasure. Paradoxically, when approval is no longer required, it often appears more naturally. Individuation does not make one rebellious or antisocial. It makes one real. The individual can now engage with the world without dissolving into it. They can accept criticism without being shattered, and acceptance without being dependent. Fear loses its authority because the self no longer rests on unstable ground. This shift is subtle but profound. Life begins to feel guided rather than negotiated. The psyche organizes itself around meaning instead of safety. Even rejection, when it comes, no longer interrupts the inner direction. And perhaps this is where real growth begins, when approval stops being the condition for living, and living becomes the condition for connection. When the fear of rejection loosens, relationships undergo a quiet but decisive transformation. Many connections are formed not through genuine meeting but through mutual adaptation. People sense what is expected of them and present only what feels safe. This creates harmony on the surface, yet it lacks depth. True relationship cannot grow where the self is hidden. It requires the risk of being seen without guarantees. I have observed that those who fear rejection often mistake accommodation for intimacy. They listen carefully, agree readily, and avoid friction, believing this preserves connection. In reality, it produces a subtle falseness. The relationship is maintained, but the self is diminished. Over time, resentment or emptiness follows, because something essential has been sacrificed for acceptance. Authentic connection demands something more difficult: presence without disguise. The risk of rejection is inseparable from this presence. When you allow yourself to speak honestly, to express feeling without calculation, to set boundaries without apology, you introduce uncertainty. The other may withdraw, they may misunderstand, they may leave. Yet this risk is the very condition of genuine relationship. Without it, connection remains conditional and fragile. Rejection, when it occurs in this context, carries a different meaning. It does not say you are unworthy. It says, this connection could not hold the truth of who you are. That distinction matters. The loss is no longer personal in the same way. It becomes informational. It clarifies what belongs and what does not. The psyche experiences grief, but not collapse. Authentic relationships deepen, not because rejection is avoided, but because it is tolerated. When two individuals meet without masks, the bond that forms is resilient. It can survive disagreement, difference, and distance. Each person remains intact. This integrity creates trust far stronger than constant agreement ever could. Those who overcome the fear of rejection often find their circle becomes smaller but richer. They are less surrounded yet more connected. Conversation becomes more alive. Silence feels less threatening. Love becomes less about security and more about encounter. Even conflict, when it arises, carries meaning rather than menace. This does not make one careless with others' feelings. It makes one careful with truth. Authenticity, when grounded, does not seek to wound, it seeks to relate. And those who can meet it recognize it instinctively. And perhaps this is the quiet reward of facing rejection. When you no longer hide to be loved, the relationships that remain are finally real. When the fear of rejection finally loosens its hold, the psyche undergoes a quiet reorganization. Life is no longer arranged around anticipation of judgment. Something deeper takes its place, an inner center that does not depend on applause or permission. I called this center the self. It is not an image, not a role, not a moral ideal. It is the organizing principle of the whole personality. When the self becomes central, fear loses its authority. At this stage, action arises less from anxiety and more from inner necessity. One speaks because something must be said, not because silence feels dangerous. No. One chooses because the choice is true, not because it will be approved. This shift is subtle, yet everything changes. Constant inner monitoring quiets. The psyche no longer asks at every step, will I be accepted? It asks, is this aligned? This single change alters the tone of an entire life. Freedom here does not mean isolation or disregard for others. It means relatedness without self-betrayal. The individual can enter relationships, work, and community without dissolving into expectation. Praise is received without dependency. Criticism is considered without collapse. Rejection, when it comes, no longer threatens identity. It is felt, understood, and integrated, but it does not define the self. I've often seen that this freedom brings an unexpected calm, not the calm of certainty, but the calm of coherence. The personality feels less fragmented. Energy once spent on managing impressions becomes available for creativity, reflection, and presence. Life feels heavier in meaning, yet lighter in fear. Even difficult moments carry a sense of participation rather than helplessness. This reorientation also changes one's relationship with fate. When fear no longer dictates behavior, life begins to unfold in ways that feel less forced. One trusts the psyche's movement instead of resisting it. Mistakes become part of learning rather than proof of inadequacy. Loss becomes painful, but not annihilating. The individual stands in life rather than shrinking before it. Such freedom cannot be achieved through technique alone. It emerges through honesty, endurance, and repeated willingness to risk being oneself. Each moment of truth weakens fear's grip. Each act of alignment strengthens the inner center. Over time, the psyche reorganizes around what is real rather than what is acceptable. And perhaps this is the deepest transformation of all. When you stop fearing rejection, life no longer asks you to hide. It invites you to stand fully in who you are.